let's play this clip of Bill Barr. Back when, and do we have a clip of that other one? Back when Donald Trump went on his little jag about send them home, talking about the members of the squad should go back from where they came from. Bill Barr came out like a couple of days later and gave a speech that was the Bill Barr version of that speech. And I mean, I think prior to that, I was well aware of his history, and which was not a positive one in my estimation. It was one where he was largely responsible for protecting people involved in Iran-Contra, and his work in the Justice Department I think it was the OLC at the time. And I always saw Bill Barr as a smarter Jeff Sessions, but one who had this ideology of the unitary executive, and that's what this was about. But when you hear the speeches that he's giving like this, you begin to realize that he is like a movement conservative who is also, it turns out, to be a bit of a religious zealot. And that this is very much about something far more insidious and complicated. Here is just a little bit of a clip of him coming out after the send them home stuff, where he reiterates what Trump is saying, but just does it in a Bill Barrian way.
My concern today is that under the banner of identity politics, some political factions are seeking to obtain power by dividing Americans, and they undermine the values that draw us together, such as a shared commitment to our country's success. This is the breeding ground for hatred, and we must reject it.
All right, so there he is. He is speaking at the podium of the Department of Justice, which knows he's got to just go down the hall to get all the statistics on right-wing violence. But he says that there's a group of people who are running on identity politics. This is right on the heels of the squad thing. And they hate America's success. They hate America, and that's what's creating violence. That is, this is Donald Trump, just with an actual education and a addled brain. And here he is over the weekend, I guess it was on Friday, now basically attacking the Constitution and the fact that Democrats should be, and that members of the House should be exercising any oversight. This guy should be impeached, because when people talk about these scenarios of Donald Trump losing the election and not leaving, this is the guy who's going to be arguing that we need to go to the Supreme Court. I mean, this is the guy who's going to be the problem. It's going to be Bill Barr. And I'm not convinced, frankly, that what they were doing in Ukraine was about 2016 as much as it was about 2020. And I don't mean just so they had dirt on their candidate. I think they wanted to create a narrative that was their backup plan for saying this election was completely hopelessly corrupted. I mean, that's purely speculation on my point. But this Bill Barr was heavily invested in going around the globe to supposedly put to rest the question of 2016, which is not being litigated. And I mean, it's not being litigated in the courts. It's not being litigated in the court of public opinion anymore. Right? I mean, I don't think the Democrats should have abandoned the Mueller report, but they seem to have. So why were they so adamant, supposedly looking for what really happened in 2016? And we're going to get this report soon. But I think that they were trying to set up some type of narrative that it's happening in the future against Donald Trump. But here is Bill Barr talking about how offensive it is that there's any congressional oversight of the executive branch of government.
Unfortunately, just in the past few years, we have seen these conflicts take on an entirely new character. Immediately after President Trump won election, opponents inaugurated what they called the resistance. And they rallied around an explicit strategy of using every tool and maneuver to sabotage the functioning of the executive branch and his administration. The fact of the matter is that in waging a scorched earth, no-holds-barred war of resistance against this administration, it is the left that is engaged in the systematic shredding of norms and undermining the rule of law.
This is such a disingenuous reading of history. Mitch McConnell on day one said we're going to obstruct everything. They said they were going to obstruct everything. And they did. They obstructed everything. Mitch McConnell even refused to allow Obama to give warning to the states about Russian interference in the election, which at that time was like, we're getting reports that they're touching the voting registries. Mitch McConnell refused to hold a nomination hearing for Barack Obama's Supreme Court pick. The idea that the erosion of norms started with the resistance, which was basically just a marketing thing to sell T-shirts to people who didn't like Donald Trump. That would be like Barack Obama coming out and talking about, I think that was literally at the beginning of Sean Hannity's show in 2009. They would say, we're the resistance. We're conservatives in exile. And like that would be having Eric Holder come out and cite that as the nation's problems. It's stunning. And really the important part is less about the relevance of him saying it in terms of how it impacts our society. It's really more relevant because it gives you a clue as to where this guy's head's at and what he's willing to do when push comes to shove. He's the chief law enforcement officer of the country. The OLC it's not quite the Supreme Court, but I'll remind you, there is never been a ruling by the Supreme Court as to whether a sitting president can be indicted. That only comes out of the Office of Legal Counsel, which is part of the Justice Department, where he used to sit during the George Herbert Walker Bush years, and where the torture memos came from. So anything the Supreme Court does not deal with, the U.S. government's chief law enforcement agency basically follows the policy that they make up. And if you think the OLC is somehow insulated from this, from the political influence of the White House, just look to the guy who's in charge of the OLC, who is now talking about the Democrats' resistance is sabotaging Donald Trump.
If only.
Indeed. We should be so lucky.